This is Colliderscope. I'm Caitlin Shore, and today I'm here with Dr. Kara Margolis, the Director of Gut-Brain Science at New York University. Dr. Margolis has leaned on collaboration and community throughout her career, and I'm so excited to talk to her today. Welcome, Dr. Margolis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I'd love to start off just by hearing a little bit about your work.
Sure. So I'm actually trained as a pediatric gastroenterologist, and the kids I see really focus on conditions that affect the gut and the brain. And I've been really fortunate to be able to segue my clinical interests into the laboratory, where I study how gut signaling, and particularly how gut serotonin signaling, affects conditions that contain disorders of the gut and the brain.
What do you find most thrilling about your job?
I think the idea that I think that I'm able to come up with ideas and actually follow them through. That, what other job do you have where you can actually come up with something in your head and actually do the things to see if it's real?
Yeah.
I just don't know anything else, any other field that has that.
So you started off as like a more pure physician, I'm guessing, and then you transitioned to also do research. Could you talk a little bit about how that transition came to be, particularly on the social level, like what it was like to go from one social context to another?
Sure. For me, it wasn't that much of a transition. When you train as a medical doctor, you really learn the value of a medical team where everyone works integrally, everybody has different strengths, everybody's at different skill levels, but everybody's considered a really valuable part of the team. So for me, when I started to run a lab, that was a very natural segue for me, that in my lab, instead of people working in parallel, people worked as a matrix. So I have people of all different levels, people have different skill sets, different strengths, and everyone works together for a common goal. But instead of taking care of a patient, it's really working towards a scientific goal. And that's been incredibly rewarding, not only on a personal level, because the lab maintains very close ties personally, but also it really enhances the scientific synergy. I'm a biomedical researcher who studies gut-brain interactions. I've spent a lot of time building an expertise in the gut, but not in the brain, and not in communication mechanisms between the gut and the brain, like the gut microbiome. Yeah. So I need people like that to work with, to build those expertise, and for that you need this kind of synergy. I guess I sort of like the theme of it takes a village, right? When my kids were younger and my husband and I were struggling to take care of two little kids and both working full time, we had many friends who had kids the same age. And so we formed this village or community where we all helped one another when kids were sick, when we needed childcare, and that extended out to a personal level as well. So when things happened personally, we were able to support one another. And I look at science that way as well. So I talked about like what goes into the lab, but it extends out to many of my other collaborations. I think pretty much all my other collaborations in what I do scientifically.
Are there any specific instances or specific people that you feel like made a major impact on that?
Sure. I mean, I'd say there are two particular ones. I think my first mentor in my pediatric gastroenterology fellowship, Harry Puthalakis. I went to interview with him, and I remember that he had me interviewing with several women, including women who weren't in his lab. And when I ultimately decided to work with him, he said, "Do you know why I had you interview with so many women?" And I said, "No, I actually was wondering why you had someone who wasn't in your lab." He goes, "Because I wanted to show you that we have successful women and you can do this." And that really left an impression on me and showed that he looked at me beyond really a fellow who was coming in to start research with him. And he really fostered that kind of advocacy and support throughout my tenure with him. And then when I moved back to New York, I worked and still work as a colleague with Michael Gershon, who I went to Columbia to work with. And I would say right from the beginning, Mike and I had a very mutually supportive relationship. He not only showed me extreme advocacy and support, taught me how to network, helped me network with the fields, and really gave me every opportunity to succeed. But he was kind. He cared about my family. Our families grew close. And they are like a second family to me. And that really taught me that, how to pass that on. And I have very similar relationships in my laboratory. So when I said it takes a village, I look at those people to help me when I need expertise in those areas, and vice versa. When they need someone like me, we help one another. And it really extends in a social context beyond the science, in that when things happen personally, that we're there to support one another as well.
Do you have, I'm not going to ask you to name names, but have you had any particularly bad collaborations or experiences with colleagues that helped you know what you don't like?
I think in general, I've been really fortunate in that I think right from the beginning, what helps you establish community and sets that example are your mentors and the environment they set up for you. I've had super phenomenal mentors who showed me not only advocacy and support, but kindness, and really emulated that in the laboratory and created environments like that. And taught me very early on that it's important that when you go into a project with someone, that you talk about your different roles in the project, that you talk about what's going to happen when a patent is issued or when a paper is coming out, who's going to be spearheading that grant. And I think people have different ideas, and certainly there have been struggles of when one person does more work than the other. But generally, I've been very fortunate in that I'm able to call those things out and call them out in a constructive way, and then we're able to move forward. I think when people realize the value in one another and like one another, it's much easier to have those conversations. I think there's a recognition in science that team science is valuable, that when you're doing research, particularly in my field, which is what I know, biomedical research, that organ systems don't exist in isolation, and that in order to understand how one organ system works, you have to understand the interplay between other areas. And not only do you need to understand the interplay on a scientific level, you need to understand it on a medical level. So when I work with collaborators now, it not only is important to have brain neuroscientists and microbiome experts, but psychiatrists or neurologists who have a clinical background so that we can actually apply our scientific findings translationally as well.
It would seem to me that science is much more efficient when you form these collaborations. Like you said, once you get to hyper specialized corners of science, there might only be one or two experts in the world, and there's no guarantee that they're going to be anywhere near each other. And I'm wondering, at the funding level, is it therefore incentivized to form these kinds of networks?
So the NIH has recognized this in recent years, and there has been a push. I think traditionally it was actually hard to get funded through multidisciplinary research because the different institutes at the NIH focus on different organ systems. But there's been a push to create workshops that have brought together people with different expertise focusing on a specific area, and to ultimately figure out gaps in research, future directions, and the resources needed, and have actually led to specific requests for applications in those areas. There's been two recent workshops, one on neurodegeneration, where they brought in experts in nervous system development and plasticity in the gut, experts in Parkinson's disease, neurologists, and brain scientists to really come together to look at Parkinson's and other types of neurodegenerative diseases. I co-led a recent workshop on neuroimmune interactions in the gut. And so the purpose of that workshop was to bring together mucosal immunologists, microbiologists, and nervous system or neuroscientists to really bring them together to talk about the state of the research, to talk about the emerging technologies that we can leverage, to look at neuroimmune interactions, and to figure out ways that we can come together and the resources needed from the NIH in order for that to happen. So there's definitely a thrust towards it, but it's definitely happened in more recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that at least the general trend seems to be towards some recognition of the value of that kind of work. Because I also feel like even at the institutional level, like at a given university, for a long time, departments were kept very separate and there weren't sort of bureaucratic mechanisms to work together. And I do feel like you see more and more institutes for that are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary.
Absolutely. I mean, came to NYU to be the associate director for clinical and translational research for a pain research center. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the thrust of what we're trying to do, is to bring together basic scientists with clinical and translational researchers and clinicians, mm-hmm. to bring together all those different facets to look at pain, but to mm-hmm. look at it from a bench to bedside level.
It's not necessarily obvious to me, like the connection between like pain and gastroenterology, and like I know pain medicine is a super interdisciplinary field itself. Can you tell me how that came to be?
What in these disorders of gut-brain interaction, abdominal pain is a defining feature. Mm-hmm. So a lot of why I went to do this is based on how my own career evolved, that I started studying the role of serotonin in the gut, that evolved into looking at nervous system development and function, mm-hmm. and looking at these disorders of gut-brain interaction. So I became an expert in serotonin signaling, which plays a role in these disorders. I became an expert in gut motility, so how fast or slow the gut moves, and I was learning about behavior or mood. So I had all these pieces in place, but what I didn't know how to study was abdominal pain, which was so critical to the diagnoses. And so it was at that point where I actually decided that I was going to try to expand my own expertise. But that sort of came to me, and that I was fortunate in that a postdoc scholar reached out to me and wanted to learn about mood and motility, mm-hmm. but she had trained in pain, and particularly abdominal pain. So I brought her into my laboratory, and together we've been exploring epithelial neuronal interactions in the gut in abdominal pain. So because of that, and because of the clinical studies I do in abdominal pain-related conditions, it was a natural segue for the Pain Research Center to be interested in somebody who had this interest in pain. Having said that, now that I'm there and have a leadership role, it's really important to be able to bring people in who do basic science and all methods of pain signaling, bring in anesthesiologists, bring in psychiatrists, but really focusing on this common thread of pain research.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting case. You said, like, in the case of the NIH historically, and then also at universities, things are usually organized according to an organ or part of the body, right? Or a system. Yeah. And then we have this thing, something like pain, that's like almost like an abstract idea. It's a subjective phenomenon, notoriously difficult to measure in a reliable way, and is inherently interdisciplinary. So which is all to say, I feel like this introduces new ways of organizing things that when you map that onto the old way of organizing things, has to become super collaborative and interdisciplinary.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you phrased it better than I ever could, is that, when you're doing this, I think just emphasizing the importance of that, not only do you need collaboration from those different aspects of science, but you need to bring it back, as when you're talking about pain or anything in medical research, back to the patient. Mm-hmm. And so you need that collaboration not only amongst scientists, but amongst clinicians and clinical researchers who can ultimately test what you're figuring out in patients. So I think it's where I think the NIH knows, I think, where scientists are aware the field is going, and is really critical to make advancements into the next era of science.
I want to pivot a little bit to your actual work, what you're doing. You obviously are doing research. You're doing research that is pretty obvious implications for the real world and real people, real patients. And I'm curious about how you think about talking about your research in different communities. So with physicians versus academics versus potentially patients.
I think that's a really important question because the audiences are very different. So when I'm asked to give a talk somewhere, the first thing that I ask the person inviting me is who's going to be in that audience. Because I know that if it's going to be mainly physicians, that I'm really going to want to emphasize the clinical importance and translation there and really focus my science on that clinical importance. Whereas if I give a talk to a group of experts in serotonin signaling, they're really going to want to understand how serotonin signaling affects these processes with some of the clinical translation, but really much more of those hardcore details of science. Similarly with patients, I think, I know what's going to be important to a patient or to a family is going to be how does it affect my child? And so there, a little bit of the science is good in that it supports what you're going to say, but you really want to do it in understandable terms so that families understand how it applies to them and what you can do to offer them treatment and hope.
What do you think are the benefits, if any, to having your one foot in research, another in medicine, and then a third foot outside of the scientific community?
So, when I started my clinical practice when I was originally at Columbia, I was approached by the group in psychiatry, and they were starting a multi-center study looking at gastrointestinal problems in kids with autism. They were starting a study, and they wanted to form a screen looking for GI conditions in kids with ASD. And so I had this really interesting group of kids that would come in with gastrointestinal issues, but also have psychiatric issues. And that made me very interested in what was this connection between depression and anxiety and disorders of gut-brain interaction. So I then went back to the lab and started bringing mouse models in, looking at the connection between serotonin signaling, mood disorders, and abdominal pain disorders. And so what you can see is there's sort of been this back and forth in that I take information from the laboratory, bring it to my patients, and then on the other side, I'm able to bring what I learned from patients and what we still need to figure out, and then bring it back to study its mechanism in the lab.
So this is interesting because there's like different layers of information flow. So there's like research to the clinic and vice versa. Then there's also, from what I'm hearing, is like you trained as a gastroenterologist interacting with psychiatrists. At this point, this is, I'm assuming, like the first time you're interacting with them seriously. And obviously, in order to connect two fields of study, you have to connect two types of people. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Like, how does the translation go? What are the social interactions like? Do they have a different culture of science and medicine than your field does?
So I think I can answer that sort of in a story of how research developed in a big project that we're now undertaking, looking at this connection between mood disorders and disorders of gut-brain interactions. So my study started simply within my lab, and I started looking at how modulating serotonin in different ways in the gut might impact enteric nervous system development and also gut function, like diarrhea or constipation. And then alongside that, looked at mouse models of in utero SSRI exposures and found that the outcomes were quite significant. So based on that, I had some really interesting findings and potentially impactful, but I had spent all my time studying the gut. And so I didn't study the brain. I was not a psychiatrist, nor had I done a lot of extensive clinical studies, but I knew that I had to extend this out to humans to make it really impactful. So I simply as a first step, went on PubMed and, asked the question, is there anybody out there looking at how SSRIs impact development of children and irrespective of maternal depression, because we know that's also an issue. And found just by doing a PubMed search that there was actually a group down the block from me at Columbia that had published a recent study. So I thought, this is fantastic. They're doing in humans, in the brain, exactly what I want to do in the gut. So I simply wrote them an email, told them who I was, went to meet with them, pitched my research and what my hypothesis was, and found out that they were about to start a prospective longitudinal birth cohort study. So we wrote a grant together using that exact same patient cohort to also look at gut outcomes. And to take that even a step further, we needed to understand how this might work. So we wanted to look at the gut microbiome. So I brought in another investigator from a different institution that studies the gut microbiome. So we were writing this big grant. So it was already a study now that went from my lab to about 5 different institutions in the United States and Canada. But we needed more of a human scientific premise. So one of the PIs that I was working and writing the grant with focused on population-based studies. And he had connections with a group in Denmark. And so we worked with them to look at 1 million patients and to really show that SSRIs may be increasing the risk of disorders of gut-brain interaction in children. So with that data in hand and with all of these collaborators, we were able to get a big NIH grant, which we're pursuing right now. And I went from, like I said, a simple study just in my laboratory to now international with multiple countries and multiple states, all within the past 5 to 7 years.
That's amazing. What are there any particular benefits or challenges of working with people who are across the globe as versus around the corner?
Sure. I think COVID really helped us in this way, in that Zoom and meetings, Microsoft meetings have become such a continuous part of what we do now and are so well integrated in that there really haven't been major issues with it. I think it's the same the same sort of idea as what we talked about a little bit earlier, in that I have a certain expertise and I conduct my expertise from where I am, and other people conduct their expertise. And as long as there's a synergy and we know how to communicate and we can form an infrastructure where samples can be sent to us and data can be sent to us, it's really been incredibly facile.
And not everybody has that skill or even the desire to work cross-functionally in that way. And I'm wondering, when you're looking for collaborators or even new members of your lab, is there a way to screen for those qualities? Is it apparent when you meet someone?
Sure. I think always it takes a little bit of luck. But when I am working with people, I guess we can start with when I interview people for my laboratory. The first question I ask is, how do you work best? Do you work best alone or in parallel with people, or do you work best with a team? And that's such a critical question for me because, as I said, everything I do is very team focused. I really also emphasize that the thing that's most important to me in the lab is kindness, and that people treat each other with respect and kindness, and that there's a general good feeling in the lab without competition. And I ask people also how they deal with conflict and ask if they have a problem with somebody or they feel like somebody's competing with them, how they help. And in those ways, I can at least garner some idea of who they are and what they are. I also tell people that the deal breakers that I guess science is a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis isn't rocket science. It's putting together experiments and carrying them through. But what's really important is being able to work with people to come to that common goal and do that. And if people can't do that, then that's a deal breaker for me in coming into the laboratory.
Yeah, and I think that's actually, you talked about building connections and likening it to raising children and having that village. And I do feel like when you feel like someone is like a friend and the social pressure of, I don't want to let my friend down is so much more powerful and positive than like, I'm scared of getting in trouble or like, I want to beat that person. I feel like as a motivating force, that's just very powerful.
I think you're absolutely right, is that, when I think about my career, I feel so fortunate that most days I really love what I do and I'm grateful to have it. But the two things that are really important to me are, one, that hopefully I can make a positive difference in people's lives, but two, that I can work with people that not only I admire and respect, but people that I genuinely like. And you're right, that adds an entirely different dimension, that when somebody's not fulfilling an expectation that I have, that I may or may not have conveyed effectively, it gives me a chance to stand back and look at that person as a person and an individual rather than just another scientist. And it adds a dimension of friendship and colleagueship. And even, some of my collaborators are like second family to me. So it adds in those factors that really allow you to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Totally. You mentioned earlier about your experience of seeking out new collaborators, finding them on PubMed, saying, hi, I want to do this project. Are there instances in which, people knocked on your door for your expertise or guidance?
Sure. I think there's a project comes to mind focusing on autism and gastrointestinal issues. And so based on sort of the clinical expertise I built up in that, I was asked to join a clinical research team at an autism residential center that had brought in a huge clinical research infrastructure and had a very specific type of diet that they were giving the kids. So they came to me and said, can you study our population and find out what our diet's doing, because our gastrointestinal and behavioral outcomes seem to be really good. And so I had this really unique population and this phenomenal clinical infrastructure to study, which was really exciting. But what I didn't have were comparator populations. So it's great to be able to look at one group and study it, but unless you can compare outcomes in kids with autism who aren't getting that diet, or kids without autism, you don't have anything to compare it to. And so I was kind of struggling with that. And coincidentally, I was invited to Baylor to give a talk. And as part of the talk, I talked about this population of kids. And a PI approached me at Baylor and said, we're about to start a cross-sectional study looking at the effects of diet on gastrointestinal and behavioral outcomes in kids with and without autism. And so basically they had the exact populations that were perfect for my study, but my study actually, or the population I was studying, actually had an intervention strategy. So we were able to pool our populations together to look at the exact same factors, and we're in the midst of writing up this paper right now. And so, this was something that without my contribution and without my co-PI's contribution, that we wouldn't be even close to making the kind of impact I think that we'll hopefully be able to make together.
That obviously sounds like very serendipitous interaction and just like the thing that you could benefit from emerged. On the other hand, it's not complete luck, right? You had to be going out to Baylor, like seeking out ways to extend your network, meet more people. So I'm just wondering how you think about the importance of going places, mixing with new folks.
I mean, I think it's of the utmost importance. I think part of what I do and part of what I, really emphasize to my mentees is that you have to be seen. Your work has to be seen. So I travel a good amount at meetings to present. I go to a lot of invited talks because I want to get out there what I'm doing, not only to expand the knowledge of people in my field or aligning fields, but also, again, to look at these areas for expansion. A lot of the collaborators I have and the things I've done have involved meeting people at a meeting where I've spoken, or going out to dinner or going for coffee with a group of people and ending up having a side conversation with somebody, and the chemistry works and the science works, and suddenly you have this work that you're doing together. And so, I think that, when what I tell my mentees and I tell everyone is, give those talks. If you're going to a meeting that's in a particular state where there's a university there and you know people, offer to give a talk in those places, because a lot of times if people don't have the funds to do it, but they'd still like to hear your science, you can go there and it can be an opportunity for these types of serendipitous collaborations.
Yep. You seem like an affable, personable person.
Thanks.
That can talk. My question is, what would your advice be to mentees who maybe just aren't naturally sociable, maybe in the context of giving a talk, they have like a little bit of stage fright, but they still, need to get out there? How would you address that?
I mean, I think that everything takes practice. I think that I still get nervous when I give talks. I still still doubt myself. And I think it's important for, young people to know that plenty of people who are senior have a lot of those same sort of nervous, get nervous about things, have those same issues. But I think when I was younger, I just forced myself to do it. I think it's critical to having people get to know you and who you are. Nothing can replace someone seeing you and talking to you about your work. You can put out a great paper, but if no one knows who you are, it just takes away I think, a big dimension.
So we've talked about a lot of your successes, the people who have said yes when you knocked on their doors. I'm wondering, what have the no's been like? Surely you've encountered some of those as well.
Sure. I've encountered a lot of no's. I think everything from multiple grant rejections, paper rejections, and sometimes just some really demoralizing comments on, I think I had a student once that had a scientific advisor, and he wrote up a thesis, and his thesis advisor gave him a bad grade and said, this isn't real science.
Ooh.
So, I mean, it's, you definitely grow a thick skin. You get mad. But I've learned through it that you sort of get over it and your perspective changes. So, there's times, we got back a review not so long ago where one of my postdoctoral scholars was so upset over the comments. And I said to her, what are you talking about? This is a great review. They're going to publish it. So I think there's definitely, it happens a lot at the beginning, but even as you get more senior, these sorts of things continuously happen. And I think understanding that along with the successes come times when you're not successful are just part of the process. And I think having an attitude towards that, I often tell my mentees to try to prepare them, maybe because this is my jaded part where I say, you submitted that to a good journal. So if it doesn't get accepted, it doesn't mean the work is bad. It's just, this is what the field is, and not everything is going to work out the way you hope it does. So I would say that, a lot of times when you look at people who are successful, all you see are the great papers and the funding, but what's behind it are a lot of papers and grants that were not accepted or funded.
Yeah. And I feel like that actually speaks to one of the important roles of community, right? Of having those people who have been there before, who can give you the perspective if you haven't quite cultivated it yourself yet.
Absolutely. I think that, and also feedback. I think that when I have a paper that comes back with 20 pages of revisions, and half of which I can't do in my lab, that I have that community to call on of people that can help me or give me feedback on how to do that. Similarly, before I submit grants, I often have other people in aligning fields read it and give me feedback on that, so that when I go in, everything comes from a group of people rather than just me alone.
What has brought you the most joy in your career?
Gosh. So many things. I feel so fortunate every day to be able to do what I do. I love taking care of kids. I love doing something in the lab that I have a chance at making a real impact on people's lives. And I love the community. I love the people that I work with, that I think I said it earlier because it's just been a constant theme that I feel so fortunate to work with people that not only do I respect and admire for their intelligence, but people who I really like, and many of whom are close friends and even second family. And so I think all those things together bring me enormous joy and gratitude. I mean, I'm a people person, and I really value relationships, and so much of what I build in my personal life has extended to my professional life. And I think, I don't know if I could run my professional life differently in that way, because the thing I value are relationships. The kinds of friendships that you form in the science world go way beyond the science. I think that, the people that I work with, many of them, I know about their personal lives. Our families get together. If someone gets sick or goes through a hard time, we're there to support one another, just like friends and family do.
It sounds like strong relationships have really been like a through line of your career, both like forming new relationships that expanded the scope of your research, benefiting from mentors. Seems like you're a great mentor yourself. I would love to be a mentee. I'm just wondering, do you have any closing thoughts on the role of community in science?
I can just say that I think community is essential to team science, and I can say that not only is it essential to the science, but I think it brings so much more joy to my career as well.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Margolis.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Colliderscope. Science happens because of community, and progress happens together. To learn more about how you can progress with ABCAM, visit abcam.com.